Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Patti Brennan Show. Whether you have $20 or $20 million, the show is for those of you who want to protect, grow, and use your assets to live your very best lives. So today we're going to be talking about a really fun, entertaining concept. It's called the fiscal stimulus. And we're going to be talking about it with none other than the professor, Eric Fuhrman, Chief Planning Officer here at Key Financial. So we're going to be doing something different this week. We're going to actually let all of you see how this sausage is actually made, because we're talking about something like the fiscal stimulus. It's a messy art form, right? And we've prepared and always prepare lots of charts and graphs and things of that nature. And when you're talking about something like this, sometimes it's just easier for you to look at the picture and for you to be able to see what in the world we're talking about. So welcome to the show. And Eric, most of all, welcome to the show for you as well.
Thanks so much, Patti. Great to be back as always. I love being in podcast studio with you, talking about all these different concepts. And I was thinking we should come up with a name for you. You know, I've been given this term of the professor, which is great. I've been called a lot of things in my life. That's a more flattering term. But maybe we should think about coming up with one for you.
Good luck with that one. Well, that's all I could say.
All I would say is we won't do it here, right? Because then you have to tune in to next week's show to figure out what we're going to do.
There you go. Okay, that's a deal. That is a deal. All right, so we're talking about the fiscal stimulus and this art form. And basically what we thought would be helpful is for us to kind of attack this three ways. Number one, we're going to go back in history and give you kind of a historical perspective of what got us to where we are today. Then we're going to be talking about this thing in terms of this output gap, which is what the theoretically the policymakers are targeting, and why deficit spending tends to work over time. At least we hope it does, right? And then we're going to be talking about where in the world do they come up with the number? Like $1.9 trillion. It's not $2 trillion. It's not $1 trillion. It's 1.9. Where in the world do they come up with that kind of a number? Mm-hmm. So, Eric, thank you so much. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Patti.
Yes. So, first, let's go into that history lesson. Yeah. Like, we have been, as a nation, through a lot of different crises, dating back to the early 1900s. Right. But something has shifted. There's been a paradigm shift in terms of how our government leaders deal with crises. Mm-hmm. So why don't you take us way, way back and bring us forward to help us understand why they're making some of the decisions they're making today?
Yeah, no problem at all. So I think you can really trace the origins of, and I love the way you phrased it, this paradigm shift in government policy, really to the Great Depression. And I think you really have to understand how policy was conducted prior to the Great Depression and in response to it to really understand where we are today, because the response that occurred there still resides with us today, 90 years later. So I think you have to start with Herbert Hoover. And, his campaign slogan when he was elected was this idea of rugged individualism. And I think as Americans, that message resonates with everybody, because I think we have always, it's part of our DNA to think that, we are individuals, a belief in small government and not intrusive, interference from a government body and so forth. But he was elected on this campaign. But what happened is the Great Depression, the stock market crash occurred about 7-8 months into his presidency. And, as the crisis worsened, his kind of ardent embrace of this promise, of rugged individualism was really antithetical to the notion that any kind of government stimulus, would be used to solve the problem, because the prevailing fiscal orthodoxy at that time was that the market was self-correcting, that the government didn't entertain ideas of activist policies of interfering in economics because the market would solve everything and it would, this invisible hand would come through and everything would correct. But, really the government policy up to the Great Depression was really all about balanced budgets. And the idea was that with a balanced budget, that would instill confidence among consumers and businesses and markets, and that encourages investment, and ultimately it is investment that sustains but also provides the foundation for economic growth. And again, that was the prevailing orthodoxy. But what happened is when the Great Depression occurred, Hoover was really, not that he didn't do anything. He instituted many policies and tried to work with businesses and so forth, but he was really against the idea of providing direct aid to families. And his view, no government had ever done this before, and to provide direct aid was really going to be ruinous to the morale and initiative of the country and kind of edge us closer to socialism. So he really rejected growing calls for the government to intervene. Round about that time, the next election cycle, Franklin Roosevelt, his platform was really based on the 3 R's: providing relief, direct aid to families, recovery through government spending, and reform through the development of social safety nets, which we have today. He won in a landslide over Hoover. And basically, he started unveiling these policies, which were completely different, as you said, a paradigm shift to what had existed beforehand. And really, a lot of these policies were based on the teachings of John Maynard Keynes, who was a British economist during this period of time that really advocated activist, what we call counter-cyclical government policies, where the government intervenes as a means to basically solve, prolonged unemployment, and so forth. And that's really where all of this came about, that still exists very much, in today's fiscal policy.
Eric, we were talking before we started, and I was fascinated during the break when we were talking about Roosevelt's propensity to issue executive orders. I was blown away by the number of executive orders that Roosevelt was doing on a year-by-year basis. Nothing close to what leaders do today, right? Why don't you give our listeners, give everybody a feel?
Well, so I thought this was so fascinating when we were doing the research and the preparation for this podcast, because you watch the nightly news today, they make such a big deal about executive orders being issued by presidents, because really this is a way that they can enact policies without getting the approval of Congress. And whether or not they're constitutional or not takes time to determine. So, if you look over, say, the recent 3 or 4 presidents have been in office in our lifetime, 200 to 400 over their entire presidency, depending on whether they serve 2 or 3 terms, is normal. So about, 30 or so, 40 a year. Roosevelt is the all-time leader. Now, he was elected to 3 terms in office, 3,712 executive orders, an average of a little bit more than over 300 per year.
Wow.
So if you think today that they're abusing the executive powers, think about what they thought about Roosevelt in that day and age when he issued over 3,700 executive orders. But yeah, an interesting little tidbit that came out of the research.
Yeah. But the New Deal definitely went through the normal channels, right? It was Congress and the Senate all approved and said, okay, we're going to do this thing.
Yep. Well, this is where, again, they started providing direct aid to families. Social Security was part of this. I think 1935 or 1937, I think, is when that came about, the modern-day Social Security system. But yeah, it took a lot to get that, but there was significant economic improvement from 1933 through 1936. He was elected again on a very strong recovery. He served 3 terms, which nobody can do nowadays.
Right.
But the policies did work, and that gave them a lot of validity, that this notion of deficit spending, the government doing the opposite of what individuals, you and I, households are doing, as a way to really not eliminate the business cycle, but reduce the amplitude of the business cycle.
So let's get into that a little bit. Let's go back and help everybody understand what that's all about. So, we've talked about this before. Your spending is my income. My spending is your income. That's the way a consumer-based society works.
Right.
So when there's a crisis that occurs, what do? We all pull back.
Right.
We did this with COVID. Certainly, people stopped spending money. Unfortunately, when we stop spending money, that means that somebody's not earning money. Unemployment skyrockets, GDP plummets, and we languish. We run the risk of going into certainly a recession, but a severe recession, and maybe even a depression. So the goal here for government is to step in where the consumer stepped out. Mm-hmm. So to your point, to reduce the amplitude and the severity of the economic outcome of the crisis, and to kind of smooth things over until the consumer can start feeling confident again, more secure. Jobs start to improve. People get employed again, and we go back to a growing economy. So that to me is the most important. Always remember that someone else's spending is your income. And when that stops, something else has to happen. Otherwise, we could eventually get back into another depression. That's how that happened.
Right. Income in aggregate falls when everybody pulls back. But what you're showing, and I think we'll probably put up a chart for our viewers, is this wonderful, very simple way to look at an economy, which is called the circular flow model, right? Where basically firms and households just continue to spend in this cycle. You know, we spend and give money to businesses. Businesses then spend through paying wages and buying goods and services, which then provides money back to households, and it just continues in this circular format.
And it provides velocity as well, right? Because, you know, that business can use that income to help even more people as a result of our spending. So, you know, and I think that that's helped, you know, a lot of economies are certainly recover in the more modern economy in a more significant way. So, okay, fine and dandy, $1.9 trillion, let's just put it in there. Where's the government going to get all this cash? I mean, we've talked about it before, Eric, and, you know, let's face it, you know, when Obama was president, you know, he issued an $800 billion stimulus package, and everyone was freaking out.
I remember, yeah. That number was, at the time, it was so astounding.
Yep.
So astoundingly large to think about 700 billion or 800 billion.
Yep.
And this is a magnitude of order above and beyond that. It's almost hard to wrap your mind around.
Over and above the 1.9 that we did last year, right?
Yeah.
So where is the government getting this cash? Let's just go, Professor, and give everybody a quick lesson in terms of, you know, this concept of printing money.
Right. So I think, you know, when the government needs to pay its bills, right, how does it do that? It can raise taxes, which would be a horrible idea. And
by the way, paying its bills includes supporting families, et cetera. That's the government's bills.
Exactly.
Unemployment insurance, things of that nature.
Exactly right. So one way is they could raise taxes, but Hoover already proved in 1931, what did Hoover do in the face of the Great Depression? He wanted to balance the budget by increasing taxes and cutting spending. That only ended up worsening the crisis. So today, when the government runs a deficit, what they do is they ask the Treasury Department to sell bonds to investors. Now, there's this idea that somehow the government just prints up the amount of money that they need. The United States doesn't work like that. That's not how it pays its bills. So if you look at, let's say, the Federal Reserve puts out what's called the Z1 report, there are trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in savings locked up in the financial system. These are bank deposits, money market funds, investments. So when the government needs to pay their bills, what they do is they issue bonds to investors. And there's a wonderful intersection, because when there's a crisis, you know, what do we just naturally want? What does our brain say?
The safest thing there is, which is Treasury bonds. We want that safety and security that only a Treasury bond can provide.
That's right. The U.S. government is the sole issuer of the risk-free asset in the entire world, which is U.S. government Treasury bonds. So what they do, they sell bonds. So all that money that is locked, that savings that is locked in the financial system, the government sells bonds, they get the cash, and then what does the government do? They spend it, and that creates income.
Right.
Income for households and businesses through aid and direct purchases, transfer payments, and so forth.
Yep. And again, just to kind of nail this shut, the Treasury bonds, okay, who owns the Treasury bonds? When we talk about they, always remember we are they. We are a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So when the government issues those bonds and we buy them, whether it be outright or via a mutual fund or a pension, is, you know, they tend to buy a lot of Treasury bonds. We own the security. We own that. That's part of our net worth. I found it interesting, and we didn't talk about this, Eric. Larry Kudlow was on one of the channels a couple weeks ago.
He's got his own show now, I hear. It
I know.
didn't take long, right?
From
on the government payroll to
Absolutely.
back to private life on TV.
Good old advertising. Works every time, right?
That's right. Yeah,
well,
he set himself up nice.
Yeah, and you know what? He was talking about how wealthy our nation is.
Oh, yeah.
The household net worth alone is $122 trillion. That doesn't even include how wealthy our government is, because our government, again, our government is us, because we are the nation of the people, by the people, for the people. So we own these assets also. But think about what the government owns. They own all of those oil fields, real estate, tons, a lot of assets that, is also part of our net worth. I've never seen anybody do a study, and this is something that I'd love for us to do. How wealthy when you put the two of them together? I mean, I've heard that the oil fields alone are worth, estimated to be $116 trillion alone, right? Then you think about the real estate. Guys, we own the White House. I think that's a pretty valuable piece of real estate. What do you think?
I don't know what it's worth, but who knows?
Yeah. So I get that, right? So they issue the Treasury bonds. I buy a Treasury. They have the cash. They spend it. So basically, the federal government is, providing kind of a bridge for our economy to replace the spending that we're not doing temporarily. Again, just to get us through. And what is interesting to me is how they go about spending, how they choose to direct those funds. We'll get into that in a minute. So let's now talk about this thing called the output gap.
Right.
All right. So why don't you define it, and then I'll kind of walk people through the potential versus the actual.
Right. So the output gap. Now I don't know about you, but I had this weird, as we were going through this and kind of developing ideas, and we started looking into the output gap and this concept of multipliers and what they call marginal propensity to consume, right? Which we're going to get into in a minute. I actually sat there and thought back to economics class. I'm like, oh my gosh, I am actually going to use this. I can't believe it. Here it is. I thought I would never, ever need this in my entire life. And here we are, right? So there is a use for it,
yes,
right? Believe
absolutely.
it or not. So any people still in school listening, pay attention, because you never know when you're going to need something from, from the classroom.
You got it.
But so the output gap is you define it. So when policymakers are trying to determine if stimulus is needed and how much, they have to determine what's called the output gap. So the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO, they make calculations of what they call potential GDP. Now, this is a theoretical construct, right? It can't be observed in reality, but potential GDP is really an estimate of how much output can be produced sustainably without creating inflation. So if we employ all of the available people out there who could participate in the labor force, how productive they are, this is an idea of the maximum kind of output that we can sustainably produce. And then there is what we're actually producing. And if we are below potential, you have an output gap.
There's
right?
your
Pretty
gap.
simple.
So basically, folks, when you think about the output gap and the potential, think about it kind of like the safe speed limit, right?
Yep.
You've got the safe speed limit. If you go too far below it, then we've got a lot of idle workers, idle factories. We're not producing to the level that we probably can. If we go too fast, then we're going much faster over the speed limit, and that could cause other problems, right? So think about it in terms of the safe speed limit. And as Eric said, it's kind of, these people are really smart, but it can change really quickly, right?
And I think the important point here, which you and I see every day, which is when there's an output gap, there is a real human cost to that. That means people unnecessarily unemployed, or underemployed. I mean, there is a human toll that is taken when you have a negative output gap that has real consequences. People let go from jobs and trying to figure out how to plan and what to do. We see the result of that when we go through these periods, and it's very heartbreaking sometimes.
It is heartbreaking, and it is very real and very raw. It comes in the form of long lines, people going to food banks, and literally people who used to work at the food bank are now in line because they need the food themselves. I mean, these things have never happened to a lot of people before. And we'll put this in the show notes, and we'll put it on the video. Where do you guys see the output gap, the graph that we've put together for you? you can understand very quickly why policymakers were as worried as they were and realized they needed to act really fast. So I think it's something that, again, it's a moving target. And it's important to recognize that it is a moving target, especially since the economy moves very quickly. You don't kind of know until after the fact, even that a recession is occurring. And certainly it's not declared over until months after a recession is officially over. So this is as we said, it is a messy art form. And while it's effective over time, it's one that needs to be monitored. And we have to be cognizant of the unintended consequences of some of the policies that are coming out.
Yeah, so what's so interesting, what you talk about, is this idea of a moving target, because the Congressional Budget Office uses very complicated statistical models run by PhDs, very smart people. But you're trying to forecast something in the future that is ultimately unknowable. So, when you and I looked at, the revisions of the output gap, because the CBO will produce revisions as time passes. I mean, if you look at, say, just last fall, if you think about where did the $1.9 trillion come from, just keep in mind that they don't write a bill in a week. I mean, this is months in the making. So when the CBO came out in October, I mean, the output gap was huge, I think, for 2021 and beyond.
I will tell you, Eric, it was exactly $1.850 trillion over a 2-year period of time. That's what they were projecting. So voila, now I get it. 1.9. They're going to inject 1.9 to fix the 1.8 gap, and here we are.
Yep.
Right? Now, fast forward, what's the latest revision of the output?
Are you saying there's a problem?
No problem whatsoever.
Gosh.
All right, good.
Well, so that's what was so astounding. I mean, I think, for us, because we operate in the financial markets, it was very encouraging news that the output gap had incredibly shrunk. I mean, it went from, for 2 years, from $1.8 trillion to $600 billion. Right. So that's wonderful, as an investor, because that shows, great signs of improvement.
I can't help but wonder if that has something to do with the $1.9 trillion that was passed last year, because as we all know, it takes a while for it to get into the system. It doesn't happen overnight. So here we are, February. The gap is much smaller, but what just got passed?
Well, it's hard to even say. I'm sorry.
Yes.
$1.9 trillion with a T to solve a problem that has now become $600 billion.
And again, to Eric's point, it's not to take away from the people who are still struggling. There are people who are really still struggling. What I think was different with this particular package was that it seems to be aimed really at the families who are still struggling, the people who remain unemployed, the families with young children. And some of these things are directly targeted to those people to give help right away. Like, those people really can't wait for 3 or 6 months for it to work its way into the system when they can get their new job and start working again and earning money and bringing food into the family. They need money now. Yep. And so when we talk about this, we talk about it within that framework and understanding that this is really important. This is what our government is for. And I will tell you that I'm happy that it got passed. And yet, at the same point, we have to be aware of what could happen on the other side, right?
Well, what's interesting is now we might venture a little bit more into the theoretical angle of stimulus, but it's this idea of multipliers. So it is not to say necessarily that $1.9 trillion is more than you need. It could be exactly right. It might actually be not enough. It depends on this Keynesian concept that was espoused back in the 1930s of, marginal propensity to consume. If the government spends $1 of stimulus, that's great, but you and I as individuals, we have choices. We might spend it, but we could also save it. We might use it to pay down debts. And when policymakers put these together, they are dependent or hopeful that the money will be spent, because if you save or invest, that money is not creating income for somebody else in this circular flow between households and businesses. So it's this marginal propensity. What is the multiple? If I spend $1, how much of that actually gets spent? And sometimes it's more than $1. Sometimes it's less. It depends on who you give it to.
Eric, I want to frame something because I never want to assume that our listeners know this stuff.
Right.
But, when we invest, let's take that concept of investing into the stock market. Let's say that you're buying Amazon stock, okay? Well, you all need to know that that's not helping Amazon, right? Amazon is not getting the growth, okay? There's an indirect benefit that Amazon might get, but they don't get that money. So it's not like if their stock doubles in price that they're given that money so that they can hire more people. So again, to Eric's point, we either spend the money, save and invest it, or we pay down debts. And you can begin to understand why policymakers may target particular families, people who really, A, need it, lower income people who may be out of work, and B, the people who are more likely to spend it because that's what's going to improve the economy. Saving, investing, and paying down debt doesn't do anything for the economy. And that's what a policymaker needs to focus on. Mm-hmm. So I think, and the idea of the multiplier, to me, kind of brings it all home in a way that, okay, now I get it. It doesn't necessarily mean that all this money sloshing around is going to lead to ridiculous amounts of inflation, because to be honest with you, not everybody is going to spend it. Right. So for every dollar, depending on where it's targeted, you might get a multiplier of 0.6, for example, mm-hmm. or 0.4, and so it has less of an impact. It still has an impact, but not quite as much as you might think.
Yeah, absolutely right. So the question is, you want to direct the spending policies to people that have a high likelihood of spending it. So that would be, for example, increasing unemployment benefits. Even with this direct stimulus checks, they are putting an income limitation on it. So it's not going to people at the higher levels of the income scale who are probably more apt to save it.
Yep.
If stimulus came to my house, I guarantee you there would be more Amazon packages.
Yeah.
Right, more than likely.
Yes.
But in any event, so if you take the current package that's been out there, it's 1.9 trillion. But when you break it apart, I think something like roughly 50% of it goes to direct aid and supplemental nutrition assistance. Another 40%, I believe, goes to states. Those are things that are likely to have high multipliers because people in need, or state governments, right? State governments don't have an incentive to save, so they're likely to spend the money. So there's likely to be a high return on those dollars that are flowing into those different entities. So there is a intelligent design behind it. Now the question is, because things have improved so much, would be, well, is it enough or isn't it enough? And,
right.
Consensus views on that are,
all over the map.
Yeah.
Okay. So
I should say professional forecasters.
Yes.
Are kind of all over the map on that.
Okay. So let's keep it real.
Yeah.
We've got, what are the risks? What are the risks of an undershoot? And what are the risks of an overshoot? I think about what they did during the financial crisis. Right. And again, we've talked about this before. I think that every time we have one of these things, our leaders learn. And what they learned from the 2008 crisis is that the stimulus was good, but it just took too long for it to be effective, that the economic recovery was quite lethargic. Unemployment, we didn't get to full employment for many, many years. The economy never really got up to that juicy 3% average GDP that is the target. So I think that the one thing that they're trying to avoid is having that story repeat itself. So they're flushing the economy with trillions of dollars. So what's the risk of an overshoot, and how are we going to know it? And then if it does happen, Eric, what in the world are they going to do?
Yeah, well, I think, and if we could, I don't know if we can bring up that slide of the output gap, here for this, but you make a great point, which is, they had massive stimulus, but look how long it took. It took almost 10 years from the financial crisis until we finally got back to potential, right? It took that long that we were underperforming. And I think the lesson, as you correctly point out, is that policymakers would much rather favor an overshoot and to try and flood as much into the system as quickly so that the recovery is much faster and we don't have this very long, drawn-out period. But you're right. If they overshoot and they overshoot dramatically, what's the outcome? And I think most people would worry about inflation. That would be the big outcome. But it seems like the Federal Reserve has communicated they are more than willing to allow inflation to be above target for some period of time. They've kind of got new guidance on that, and they seem confident that they have the tools to rein in inflation if it becomes a problem.
And again, the new target, for those of us who have been around for a little while, is above 2%. Well, I will tell you that when I first started over 30 years ago, the thought of a 2% inflation rate was like nirvana, right? It was running at 6%, 7%. Our mortgages were much higher, et cetera. So, that's a very low inflation rate, right. And that's what our leadership has determined that is very sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So let's kind of pull this together. And by the way, we can talk about the Federal Reserve and all the tools they have to dampen the inflation.
I might refer our listeners back to the wonderful podcast we did last year, part 1 and 2 on the national debt. There's a lot of parallels between this and that, right?
You know what, Eric? You know what we should do also, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to commit to this. Let's take our papers, the work that we did to prepare for those podcasts, because we weren't filming at that time. We're going to put those on the website, because there you're going to see how the story unfolded, all of the graphs and charts and the things that we did and the research that we did over the summer. I will tell you, I was taking a course from Professor Fuhrman. I might have thrown in a point or two, but it was really interesting stuff. Again, to the extent that you want to understand this, I think at the end of the day, we just want to share the information in a way that hopefully you can understand it, and give you confidence that while it is messy, they're figuring things out. Okay? So number one, we have the benefit of a rich history. And boy, do we ever. We've been through a lot in this nation. And little by little, slowly but surely, we seem to be, getting out of these crises. It's not that we don't have them. It's just that we know what to do when it happens. We learned how deficit spending is used and how it's used and why it's used to bridge the gap so that the depth of the crisis isn't nearly as deep as it would be normally. And last but not least, we learned about the output gap and where our leaders come up with this magic number of $1.9 trillion and how they think about who's going to receive that and how that's going to come into the economy.
Yeah, well, so I think maybe kind of a good way to bring it to closure that you and I were talking about is that now we're starting to see economic estimates of what the growth forecast is going to look like not only for this year but next year. And I think, it's eye-popping in terms of the numbers. And I think this fiscal stimulus has a lot to do with that when we think about our near-term outlook over the next 1 to 3 years.
We talked before about Ben Bernanke's 60 Minutes broadcast, and at that point he talked about the fact that he was beginning to see green shoots coming out of the ground. Let me tell you something. This is bamboo. This is growing like crazy. Estimates are closer to 6% GDP for this year alone, and it actually just trends down. So it'll be very interesting. Again, I know we're nerding out on you, by the way, and I apologize for that. I just think that it's comforting. I think I like to read and understand this because it makes me feel more confident in our leadership. And, we're going to figure it out. Again, that's the way these things tend to work.
Nerding out's okay. My favorite times are Key Financial is when you nerd out, Patti.
Totally. Well, and Eric, the one thing that we have to remember also is that we're all doing this. Mm-hmm. They're all doing this, and we're having all this stimulus in the midst of something that never happened before, and that is, 6 foot social distancing, right? So we're not able to go out there and spend the money maybe that we normally would. So what does that look like?
Yeah, there's a well-established history where academics can go back and figure out how effective stimulus was after the fact, but they never had to do it when social distancing was there. So part of me thinks that, yes, the package seems way, larger than the problem, but you've never had an issue with social distancing. So how effective can it be in an environment like we've never ever seen before?
Mm-hmm.
So that's, we'll learn a lot. I know that much.
Hey, guys, I'm still at Tina. I'm literally, there is no alternative. So people are saving it and investing it, and I think that has something to do with why the market has been going up as well. Not everything. There are real fundamental reasons, but there's no other alternative. Right. So anyway, fun as always, Professor. Thank you so much for all the research and the back and forth you and I did over the weekend. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate you. These podcasts don't happen unless you are tuning in and you're listening. And we are hearing so much from you. And I'm just so grateful that you make us feel as if this is worthwhile, that it's making a difference in your lives. Because honestly, that's what it's all about. So I'm Patti Brennan, Key Financial, Eric Fuhrman. Thank you so much, Professor.
Highlight of my day.
Highlight of your day.
Always.
Now we're going to get back to work. So I hope you all have a terrific day. Take care now. Bye-bye.